Last Word with Matt Cooper on Today FM.
John McCartney, the Director of Research at Savills, the estate agents, is with us. John, how many people, does it reckon, now are living in rented accommodation in Ireland?
Just under 900,000, Matt, currently living in the private rented sector, and that's an increase of about 39,500 over the last 12 months.
And how many more would you expect to be looking for private rented accommodation next year?
Well, the way things are going, property prices are rising by 10, 11, 12, 13%. And earnings are rising by 1.7% per annum. So it's becoming harder all the time to buy a property, and tight mortgage lending isn't making that any easier. So my expectation is that the rental sector will grow, not necessarily because people are choosing to rent, although I believe some people are choosing it as a lifestyle, but I think largely because they've nowhere else to go.
Could it be another 40,000 people next year?
Sure, yeah, why not?
More?
Yeah, why not?
Where are they going to go? Where's the rented accommodation for them?
Well, it's an interesting aspect of the report. What we've seen for a long period is pretty steady household sizes in the rental sector, but that has changed in recent times. Since the beginning of 2006, there's been a steady increase in the size of the average rented household, and our interpretation of this is that renters are clubbing together, A, because they simply can't find the properties to rent because the vacancy rate is just so tight, but B, because the costs of renting have increased. And we've been using this example of a couple. In the past, they might have rented a two-bedroom apartment, but they're no longer doing that. Increasingly, we're seeing couples go for a one-bedroom unit in Dublin. That's about 300 quid a month cheaper. And who's going into the two-bedroom unit? It's two couples, four people to make the rent.
You'd want to get on well with another couple in a two-bedroom apartment, wouldn't you?
Well, you have to question whether it is a sustainable lifestyle, but in a really tight market, that's what we see. We see that these pragmatic solutions just bubble up out of nowhere. What we're also seeing, of course, is an increasing number of young adults that can't cut the apron strings and break away from the family home at all. The census showed there was about 460,000 of those in April 2016, young adults living at home with their mum and dad.
Enda McGuan is with us as well, Managing Director of Winters Property Management. Is this what you're seeing as well in the rental sector?
Good evening, Matt. Yeah, unfortunately it is. And I mean, it's not yesterday, today it started. I mean, this has been ongoing for a number of years. The reality is that stock is the key issue out there, both Galway, Cork, all the big cities. We have seen our employment rate drop dramatically over the last couple of years, and we haven't seen construction commence, or we haven't seen the development of sufficient stock. We also have, I think, wage rates are a factor as well. I think we have a lot more younger people, the millennial generation, coming into the workforce at this point in time. And I think we also, their requirements for properties are different to what we have heretofore had in Ireland.
Why? In what way? What are they looking for that's different?
I think in reality, when you look at them, they look for a 15 to 30 minute commute max. They don't particularly have a desire, in many instances, to live outside the city centre. They like to live and recreate in the city centre, call it the live, work, play environment. They are not interested in car parking spaces because they don't want to buy a car, they use public transport. Yet, from a supply base, we are building apartments, or the regs would stipulate that we can only build apartments with car parks costing 35,000 a space, certain aspects, certain apartment sizes. I mean, we're not catering for how they like to live, and I think that's the biggest issue we have. We know that cost is a factor in construction. We know that that's what's delaying a lot of it kicking off, and I suppose that we need to address our regulations and our systems to cater for the new demand.
Yeah, and John, what about this thing, you sort of alluded to it earlier, that there may be a sort of a societal shift, that people are happy enough to rent rather than buying, but how much of that is forced upon them, and that rents are so high, in some cases higher than a mortgage would be. How the hell are these people ever going to be in a position to actually save enough money for a deposit to get a mortgage? Indeed,
yeah. I think it's an open question, actually, as to whether the millennials, as we call them, do have a preference for renting. It would seem to me that if you can buy a place and your monthly mortgage repayment is cheaper than the rent on the same property, it's a no-brainer to buy the asset.
Yeah, this renting has been forced upon them, and then perhaps they've been told, sure, that's the lifestyle you're choosing, when that's actually not the reality.
Well, and we've discussed it before, haven't we? The idea that, look, our whole social model is set up around home ownership. Take pensions as an example of that. The model we have is that you get married in your 20s, you pay off your mortgage by the time you retire, and you live rent-free for the rest of your life. Now, that suddenly falls apart if you rent.
If you're renting.
Yeah, because, most people are able to get by on pretty modest pensions. But what happens if you reach retirement age and you don't own your own property and you have to pay a rent out of a small pension? That's a problem.
And then what do you make of what Enda was saying, John, about this thing about perhaps not building the right type of apartments when we are building them?
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. Certainly, construction costs have risen quite sharply in recent years, and the standard of apartments is very good. I think you could argue that, look, we have 40% fewer 20-somethings than we did 10 years ago, and that's not going to change very quickly. So maybe you could argue that the regulations are right, and what we should be focusing on is building bigger, better apartments rather than small units. I think that's an open debate.
Okay, and another issue, and I'll finish with you in this, Enda McGran. An interesting text from Susan in Dublin 13. I'm separating. I have 2 small children. I can't afford to rent or buy a 2-bed apartment. Not enough accommodation for this group of people. And that is something I've met a lot of people, Enda, presumably as well, coming into the rental market because of a breakdown of a relationship.
Oh, absolutely, and it's also a fundamental problem from the social housing demand. I was only at a conference last week where it was highlighted the demand for social housing. One of the highest areas is single bed apartments, basically based on how either people coming from relationships or the backgrounds they're coming from. And unfortunately, our planning is still dictated by 2-3 bed apartments. I think that realistically, what we've seen for the last 6 years, we've seen 6 different ministers responsible for housing. I suppose we've seen lots of plans and lots of proposals. What we really need is a requirement for things to be brought together, both the supply and demand, and identify an appropriate balance of stock, be it apartments, houses, and be it city centre and suburban living.
Thank you very much, Enda McGran from Winters Property Management, and John McCartney from Savills for joining us here on The Last Word on Today FM. 087 4100 102 for your text.